Welcome everybody to this Chatham House webinar briefing in which we'll be reflecting on the recent elections which have taken place in Japan. My name is James Hanna. I'm the Assistant Head of the Asia Programme here at Chatham House, and today's speaker is Dr. John Nielsen-Wright, who's Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia on the Asia Programme at Chatham House and also Senior Lecturer in Japanese Politics and International Relations at Cambridge University. This event is on the record, and before we start and I hand over to John for his initial presentation, I'd just like to draw your attention to the box at the bottom left of your screen. This is where you can raise questions, which we will try to have answered at the end of the presentation. Any technical concerns that you may have, and we'll try and address those also. When this snap election was called, there was a sense that it might be a problem for Abe and that he may have overplayed his hand. However, in fact, he has come out victorious and indeed with a supermajority. What all of that means and where we go from here domestically in a Japanese context and also regionally, given that we've also had the Chinese Communist Party Congress in the past week, and Donald Trump is about to travel to the region next week, will be explored by John. And with that, I hand over to you.
Thanks very much, James, and good morning, everybody. Well, yes, just let me start with that point you made about the surprise turnaround, because when Mr. Abe announced the election back at the end of September, there were indeed lots of expectations that this was a very risky strategy. Was he going to blame? Was he going to effectively gamble and lose? Why was that? I mean, I think a number of reasons. The Prime Minister himself was very unpopular on the back of two very high-profile scandals involving education policy, where the Prime Minister had been accused of favouring friends of his, and his wife had also been drawn into some of the controversy, and a general perception that the LDP and the Prime Minister himself had lost the trust of the electorate. There were lots of accusations of the arrogance of the LDP, and in particular, the emergence of a new, what seemed to be at the time, a new effective populist challenger in the form of Mrs. Koike, the governor of Tokyo. The reason why Koike was seen as a credible challenger was that her political movement had been dramatically successful back in July in the Tokyo metropolitan elections. Her organization, known as Tomin Noto, the Citizens' Party, if you like, had won no fewer than 49 out of 50 seats in the metropolitan elections. By contrast, the LDP had seen its 57 seats slashed to 23, and there was the emergence of women candidates, 32% or thereabouts of the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly. So Koike, as a female candidate, seemed like a real contender. Part of that was a function, I think, of her style. A former journalist, she knows how to play the media game. Many people were making parallels between her and former Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who at the turn of the century had, if you like, redefined the dynamics of Japanese politics. But also she was seen as somebody who, with her own experience, having served as defense minister in the first Abe cabinet back in 2006, had some claim to policy expertise, and generated quite a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the media and the electorate. She called in the run-up to this election for a reset of politics, presenting herself as a challenge to the old established guard, the old guard of Japanese conservative politics, mainly men. She released a very slick campaign video that seemed to epitomize that argument. And Abe, as I said, was seen as not only perhaps lacking in trust and too arrogant, but also unable to deal with the fundamental structural problems of the Japanese economy and politics in general, what I've referred to as the three Ds. Debt. Japan has 230% of the value of its GDP is its national debt. The demographic problems of a rapidly aging society and the policy problems that causes Japan, and also de-alignment, the fact that Japan's voters have detached themselves from their traditional party loyalties and are much more dispassionate in choosing who to vote for. So in calling this snap election, Mr. Abe was gambling. He was trying to repeat the performance he had achieved in December of 2014, when he had similarly dissolved the Diet early for a lower house election, which he had won handily. His motivations, as he said publicly at the time of the dissolution back in September, were twofold. One, to get a mandate from the Japanese people to support his tough line towards North Korea. And secondly, a change in fiscal policy and tax policy in particular. The government had committed to introduce its new version of VAT, or to increase VAT from 8 to 10% in 2019. Abe was saying, I want to change the motivation for using that tax away from reducing the debt and instead using it for a host of progressive issues designed to meet the needs of a younger electorate by providing free childcare, boosting education and welfare spending. The trouble with that argument was that much of the electorate at the time that he made this announcement, some 70% according to one poll, saw him as being overly opportunistic. This was a political, tactical game rather than a sincere reason justifying the dissolution. The other reason why I think, the less sort of public reason why he had decided to move at this time, was that the main opposition party at that stage, the Democrats, were flatlining in the polls at 7%. Kibonoto, Koike's new party, had yet to be formed, but there was certainly political straws in the wind that suggested that this was coming. So Abe wanted to move quickly to offset the new party's momentum and also to capitalize on the weakness of the main opposition party. The result, however, contrary to all the expectations, was dramatically different. Just a few words about the structure of the lower house, because I think it's important to understand the complexity of this election. Japan's lower house is elected on the basis of a two-stage electoral process, or there are two divisions, two votes that every elector has in Japan. One vote for single-member constituencies, much as in the United Kingdom, first past the post, and then a second PR contest, adding up to 465 seats altogether in the lower house, 289 first past the post seats and 176 seats elected through PR. The LDP has done very well, securing 284 seats altogether, 218 in that first past the post contest and 66 in the PR contest. The first past the post contest is important because the LDP secured some 48% of the votes, but because of the non-proportional element for that contest, achieved a whopping 75% of the seats in the first past the post contest. Together with its main coalition ally, Komeito, the current seats for the government in the lower house add up to 313 out of 465 seats, more than 2/3 of the seats in the entire parliament. This is really important because it allows the government not only to pass legislation in general, but also to effect constitutional change, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. So a victory in terms of its actual numerical score, giving it a solid position, but not much change. In fact, the swing to the LDP as a result of this election is a fractional 0.02%. Even though the number of its seats has gone down, we saw 10 seats removed from the official tally of seats in the lower house as part of a redistricting announcement, and therefore the actual proportion of seats has gone up for the government. Why did it do so well? Well, this election was less a vote for the LDP and more a failure on the part of the opposition, and spectacularly for Kibonoto, despite all of those high hopes, despite fielding no fewer than 235 candidates in this election, it managed to achieve a mere 50 seats, and even in its political heartland, Tokyo itself, just 1 out of 25 first past the post seats. So a very, very disappointing result for Kibo. One party that has done well is the remnant of the Democratic Party, which, now rechristened as the Constitutional Democratic Party, achieved 55 seats. Not very many by comparison with the LDP, but enough to give it the front leading position as the main opposition party. Those are the numbers for the opposition. Why did Kibo do so badly? I think for two primary reasons, both tactical and substantive. Tactically, the problem for Ms. Koike was that when she announced her party, to the surprise of many observers, the leader of the Democratic Party, a man called Maehara Seiji, who had just been elected as leader of the party, announced to everyone's surprise that he was going to run as an independent and he wanted all of his party members to join the new organization. One might have thought that Koike would simply welcome all of those party members with open arms, but she implied instead quite a clear political litmus test, agreeing that she would only take those members of the DP who were unambiguously conservative in their political preferences, i.e. supporting strong defence and constitutional revision. By contrast, the more progressive members of this quite heterogeneous party decided to form their new party, the Constitutional Democrats, with a much more explicit set of progressive policy proposals. The second reason I think why Koike did badly was that she had chosen to remain as governor of Tokyo, to not run in this election. And by doing that, she sowed confusion in the minds of the electorate. One simple question: if Kibo-Noto had done as well as people expected, who would be the new prime minister? There was no clarity on this, because with Koike serving as governor, she would not be constitutionally entitled to take on the prime minister's role. And then substantively, Kibo-Noto tried to be all things to all people by embracing both conservative and progressive policy issues. Conservative on the constitution, on security issues, progressive on welfare and education, but hedging on some of the key issues that matter arguably to a sizable part of the electorate, suggesting that it would not support the increase in the consumption tax despite all the fiscal pressures given Japan's high level of debt, and also on the one hand sounding its opposition to nuclear power, but at the same time committing to only phase out those nuclear reactors that are critical for Japan's energy needs, and therefore sending a very ambiguous signal to the electorate. In what way was Kibo offering anything really new or significant or distinctive? It looked as if it was a lightweight version of the LDP. By contrast, the Constitutional Democrats had authenticity on their side, in the sense that they had very clear, explicit policies that were different from the government. No to nuclear power, no to constitutional revision, and also a great deal of enthusiasm associated with their new leader, Mr. Edano, who cleverly relied on social media and a Twitter-driven campaign to energize his base and his electorate. So a victory for the LDP, the fragmentation of the opposition parties, and a weakening, therefore, of the opposition field in general. Does this add up to a real mandate for Mr. Abe? I would say no, for a variety of reasons. As I said earlier, this was a continuity vote, not really a vote for change. At best, I think we can say that the Japanese electorate demonstrated their risk aversion, particularly on the part of young people. This was the first election in which 18 and 19-year-olds have voted, and all the poll indicators suggest that they're quite strong supporters of Mr. Abe. And it's easy to understand why they back the LDP. The LDP has delivered economic prosperity. We've seen the longest period of sustained growth in 11 years. In the second quarter of this year, the economy grew 2.5%. Stock market is doing well. Unemployment is at a historic low, at least since the bursting of the bubble in the 1990s. The tough line the government has promised on North Korea is a reassuring point of stability. Why change government at a time of major international tension? And therefore, the government's ability to capitalize on that risk aversion has worked in Abe's failure. That being said, Mr. Abe should not be too confident. And here again, I think we need to look at the numbers. If you look at the PR contest, those two main opposition parties, the Constitutional Democrats and Kibo-Noto, if you add up the total of their support in the PR contest, they got 37% of the vote, by comparison with the LDP's 33%. So the LDP is not unambiguously the first choice of the electorate. It won because the opposition was divided. As for the future, what can we say? Well, I don't think there's going to be much change, certainly in terms of the composition of the cabinet, which was after all only appointed in August of this year. We're likely to see Mr. Abe, I think, double down on some of his signature policy issues. The so-called third arrow, structural reform of Abenomics, continuing commitment to TPP 11, promotion of smart cities, joined-up government, reform of corporate governance, efforts to combat excessive overtime, and very importantly for the government in terms of keeping the economy moving, trying to push for an increase in wages. Both as a way of offsetting the impact of the consumption tax when it's introduced in 2019, but also as a way of stimulating greater demand. We will probably see continuity in monetary policy. Mr. Kuroda, the governor of the Bank of Japan, may be reappointed, or we may have a similarly loose monetary policy supporting governor appointed when the Prime Minister has to make his decision later later in the next few months. A big issue for Mr. Abe will be paying for those generous welfare promises, particularly free childcare. In foreign policy, I think we're going to see, in the first instance, a focus on cementing the US-Japan relationship, looking ahead to Trump's visit in early November. Mr. Abe has signaled that he supports a tough position towards North Korea, certainly in terms of sanctions, but for very obvious reasons, not least geography. Mr. Abe does not want to see war on the Korean Peninsula, even if some people perhaps in the defense establishment might grudgingly have to accept that they think that some sort of military action may ultimately be necessary to offset the risks of North Korea. But from the point of view of the government, that's obviously the least attractive option. So stability, both in terms of deterrence, keeping North Korea in its box, but also getting assurance and reassurance from the United States that it's going to support Japan's own security interests. We will also continue to see Mr. Abe pursue his signature policy of proactivism in foreign affairs. We've just had an announcement from the foreign minister, Taro Kono, calling for a new Indo-Pacific coalition between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, potentially with the UK and France as supporting partners. A much more expansive approach to regional security, a much more ambitious agenda for Japan in foreign affairs, but again, an element of continuity in terms of foreign policy. The one area where I think we're going to have a lot of interesting developments is in the field of identity politics and constitutional change. This really matters personally to Mr. Abe. This is the thing he most wants as his legacy as Prime Minister. And in that, he's very much on the same page as his Conservative colleagues who see the 1947 Constitution as a foreign document imposed by the Americans back in the occupation years, reeking of butter, as some people sometimes say in Japan, too foreign. Undercutting Japan's ability to define itself as having its own autonomous indigenous political system. And he has the numbers in the lower and upper house, 2/3, with his conservative partners, including, importantly, Kibo no To. The problem for Mr. Abe is that there is an alternative national identity narrative on the left of the political system. Those people who support the constitutional Democrats, older voters in their 60s and above, see Japan as wedded to a global agenda that is centered around the United Nations and the doctrine of pacifism that is at the heart of Japan's post-war political identity. And the public is split pretty much evenly between those two different approaches. Abe sensibly, I think wisely, has backed off on this in terms of his post-election statement, saying that he wants to build a consensus. He is not committed to the 2020 deadline for constitutional reform. And he will want, I think, to work carefully to build up public opinion in support of this change. And the key reason for that is that not only does he need a 2/3 majority in both houses to support the constitutional revision, he also critically needs to win a national referendum. And if there is one lesson from Brexit that the Japanese take seriously when it comes to referendums, is be pretty sure that you can win them if you call them. And I think he's going to have to work quite cleverly to try and bring public opinion on board. If he does, he will have achieved something really dramatic. He will be able to claim, I think, quite legitimately to have reset the terms of post-war Japanese politics. But with that, I'll end and we can take questions.
Fantastic. John, thank you very much. We have received a number of questions, which I'll sort of try and group together, but also split up, starting with some domestic issues. You started out talking about the context in which Abe called the election. Olivia Beer asks a question about whether it's accurate to say that this calling of the election was an attempt to gloss over or put to bed the corruption allegations against the Prime Minister. Maybe let's start with that, and then we'll move into some others.
I think it's a fair interpretation. Obviously, the government wouldn't represent their choice in those terms. There's no doubt that Mr. Abe had seen a quite significant fall in his popularity into the mid-30s and had been on the ropes in the Diet after a series of quite pointed questioning from opposition politicians who had hammered him intensively on this question of these two scandals. Now, one could argue that the Japanese public is inured to these sorts of corruption scandals. It's very much part of the political culture, if you like, of not just the LDP, but also past governments going back to the early post-war period. But don't forget, this is a political system in which the LDP has been the dominant force in post-war politics. And Mr. Abe, of course, in power since 2012. There's always a danger that the party becomes complacent and is therefore more susceptible to these sorts of temptations. And the emergence of a more discriminating electorate, which is concerned about economic welfare and equality, and the perception that politicians are losing touch, made the Prime Minister quite vulnerable. And like any tactically minded politician and Prime Minister, in a system where the Prime Minister has the freedom to dissolve the Diet ahead of the end of its 4-year term, it made sense, I think, for Mr. Abe to move sooner rather than wait, and the situation might have become more politically challenging for him and the LDP.
Thank you very much. I think that maybe brings, I mean, so the result is obviously that there is this the supermajority. Peter Price asked a question early on with regards to the role and composition of the upper house, and I suppose in a sense that also ties into this question. Even if, as you say, Abe may not possess the mandate that it appears that he has, what are the different roles of the different houses, and what is the implication of the supermajority?
One of the things that's really striking about the Japanese bicameral system is that the upper house actually has a lot of checking power. It's only on key issues such as budgets and treaties that the lower house can, in fact, unambiguously override the upper house. So having that 2/3 majority in both houses is really important. But really, for the first time in the post-war period, the LDP has that commanding position with its conservative allies. This is a real change. Throughout the post-war period, the LDP, despite having been in power pretty much unchallenged from 1955 until the early 1990s, and despite having many of its members committed to the idea of constitutional revision, was never in a position to effect change because it never had that 2/3 majority in both houses simultaneously. So this is a real, you could say, once in a political lifetime opportunity for Mr. Abe, which is why he's pushing so, I think, deliberately in this direction. But he has to manage the optics and the atmospherics very, very carefully because of those public doubts and concerns.
Right, and I mean, well, he has a long-standing commitment or concern to constitutional reform, which you've mentioned. A couple of questions that kind of interlink on that, and I would accept that looking at constitutional reform tends to be framed about foreign and security policy. So Christian Ploberger says, to what extent did the potential reorientation of the foreign and security role of Japan play a role in the elections? And in a way, that links to a question from Jeff Logan about the role of the crisis with North Korea, or the threat from North Korea. Abe has been fairly consistent throughout the election campaign, talking about the threat from North Korea, and upon his victory, said my priority is to deal with North Korea. We'll get to U.S. relations and Trump's visit shortly, but to address those two questions, to what extent did this reorientation or new potential role influence the way that people voted, and how much, I suppose, did the North Korea security threat drive the vote, and how much those interlinked?
That's a complicated question in some ways, because I think we have to unpack, first of all, the question of motivation for constitutional change. This is not really about giving Japan more freedom to do more in foreign policy. Already, the LDP, as a result of some important legislative changes introduced in September of 2015, can engage in collective self-defense, can deploy its forces beyond Japan's territorial waters without any need for a formal change of the constitution. What Mr. Abe was proposing, although kind of sort of voce, he wasn't making it, it's part of the manifesto, but it wasn't part of the campaign in a front and center position, was to strip away the ambiguity about the role of Jieitai, the so-called self-defense forces. Article 9 of the Constitution prohibits Japan from maintaining a standing military for anything other than defensive purposes, and defense has typically been defined very, very restrictively. By introducing that legislation in September of 2015, the government was able to stretch that definition to allow the self-defense forces to be used in a way that could be still defined as defensive. So protecting not only Japanese territory, but also the livelihood of Japanese people. and their personal security and access to all the things that add up to the security of Japan. That's, of course, a very elastic definition. Consider, for example, protecting sea lanes of communication so that Japan can trade, can get access to critical raw materials. So changing the constitution is not necessary as a means of projecting force and being more proactive, but it's really important as an expression of identity politics, of Japan regaining a sense of autonomy and being master of its own political destiny. And I think that's important to emphasize because for Japan's neighbors, particularly for China, to a lesser extent South Korea, the constitutional revision motive is often presented as an attempt to turn the clock back to the 1930s. And I think that's a mischaracterization of the broad conservative viewpoint, even if there are some nationalists, of course, who have a different agenda. As for North Korea, to what extent has that been part of the electoral calculations of the government and the response of the electorate? There's no doubt, I think, that Mr. Abe recognizes that the North Korean challenge is a huge problem. And you could argue that staying in power and having the patience and time to work carefully with not only the Americans, but also with the South Koreans, and even potentially North Korea. We shouldn't forget that Mr. Abe was in government at the time of the Koizumi administration in 2002 and 2004, and the then Prime Minister of Japan visited North Korea for talks about the possible normalization of relations. We're a long way off from that at the moment. Mr. Abe might, at some point, if the political and diplomatic and security situation were to improve, and let's hope it does, to embrace that sort of strategy. I think that level of experience, going back many, many years now, may have been a factor in explaining why some voters chose to support the LDP rather than risk the possibility of a perhaps untested and inexperienced leader, whether it was a prominent member of Kibun no To or somebody else.
And just to say, we've got just over 5 minutes to run. It's a really interesting issue on which I'd be very happy to talk at length, or at least ask questions at length. However, just to make sure that we do raise all questions raised, James Burton asks about the implications of this election for the EU-Japan EPA and TPP-11, which you mentioned. What is the outlook for those initiatives coming off the back of this election?
TPP-11, well, obviously, Japan, Abe, I think, personally feels privately deeply betrayed by the United States, having gone to the mat to get this complicated agreements through domestically, particularly in the LDP heartland, the rural constituencies where farmers who have traditionally been big supporters of the LDP were opposed to TPP. Mr. Abe, I think, can feel understandably annoyed that the Americans have, if you like, undercut the agreement. Looking ahead, I think there are a number of issues on the agenda, not least the apparent decision of the New Zealand government under its new leader to call for a renegotiation of TPP in November. This is going to be tough for Mr. Abe. He needs to keep the 11 together. Beyond that, when it comes to the EU EPA, this again, I think, is a long-term goal of the administration. They recognize the importance of developing those closer ties with Europe. On the back of Prime Minister May's visit to Tokyo, there is still, I think, a strong sense of frustration on the part of the Japanese business community and the political leadership at the lack of clarity on where Japanese firms stand and where Britain stands on Brexit. The scale of Japanese investment in the UK going back to the 1980s means that Japanese companies are very much exposed, and they are not convinced that the deal, if a deal is ever reached on Brexit, will meet their own interests.
Just doubling back briefly because we're of limited time. Roger Gifford asks what happens to Governor Koike's party now, and in fact, what happens to the CDP now? Where do these new political actors? What's their role? What's their position, and where do they go? Given, I suppose, in Koike's case, most obviously, there was a kind of an early stage bubble bursting.
Well, Koike herself has come out publicly in the last day saying she will stay as leader. She's not about to fall on her political sword, despite this incredibly dismal outcome, which she herself, I think, quite sensibly has described as a disaster. Within her party, there are obviously lots of disappointments. Some people have criticized her, but I think there will be an attempt to try and keep Kibor-Noto together. Mr. Maihara, the former leader of the VPJ, is intent on staying within Kibor-Noto. He's also made it clear that he won't try and take the funds of the Democratic Party and transfer them over to the new organization. So I think Kibor-Noto is going to have a hard job selling itself as a distinctive party separate from the LDP. They will probably collaborate with the LDP on constitutional issues. The party that has the best future, I think, is undoubtedly the Constitutional Democrats, because they are, if you like, the one clear voice of progressive opinion in Japan. And therefore, I think they will double down on their distinctive message and can build on that base, perhaps by drawing in people from other parties, the former Socialist Party and now the Social Democrats, and perhaps some sort of tactical alliance with the communists to try and undercut the government. But at the same time, the electorate has shown itself that it's broadly, with a small c, quite conservative. So one shouldn't underestimate the task of the CDP.
One final question I'll chuck in. We're going to close in a couple of minutes. President Trump is going to be in Japan, I think on the 5th of November. What do you think Abe will seek to get out of those meetings and those discussions? To ask a question that it's impossible to possibly answer.
First and foremost, I think good optics, right? He doesn't want any embarrassments. President Trump will meet with the emperor apparently, so that'll be an interesting discussion. One would love to be a fly on the wall to hear what that conversation is like. He will also play a round of golf with the Prime Minister, and that's a good opportunity. Of course, it was candidate Trump, or President-elect Trump, who met with Abe in the run-up to taking up his position as president and played another round of golf. So I think the personal dimension of this relationship, it's already being framed in personal terms, the Donald-Shinzo dialogue. As I said, I think it will be focused very much on the North Korean issue and avoiding, this is I think where Japan is a little worried, pressure from the United States for a bilateral trade deal. This is not something that Japan and the LDP wants to get entangled in. So keeping things as broad as possible is probably top of the agenda and focusing on those security issues.
Fantastic. John, thank you very much for your time. I hope we've answered all the questions, and thank you very much for sending them in. If you look to your screen, you can see some details of upcoming events at Chatham House. Please also pay attention to the upcoming events being organised by the Asia Programme, which includes an event in December with Alexis Dudden, who will talk about Japan's relations with South Korea. Thank you once again, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.